Welcome to the high-level event, The Role of the United Nations in Combating Antisemitism. This event is presented to you by the World Jewish Congress and the Permanent Mission of the Federal Republic of Germany to the United Nations. My name is Gila Baumöl. I am a member of the World Jewish Congress Jewish Diplomatic Corps from Germany. The Jewish Diplomatic Corps is the flagship program of the World Jewish Congress, with over 300 professionals from all over the world acting in the fields of diplomacy and public policy on behalf of world Jewry. I will be the moderator of today's event. On behalf of the World Jewish Congress, I would like to thank the Permanent Mission of Germany for realizing this high-level event. I would also like to express my gratitude to all of the missions co-sponsoring this event. My special thanks go to our distinguished speakers, to the 5 panelists, and to the states who have submitted pledges. A warm welcome to all the viewers across the platforms. This online event is being recorded and live streamed on the World Jewish Congress's website, on YouTube, and on Facebook. Why are we holding this event? In the past years, we have been witnessing an increase of anti-Semitism worldwide, in words and in deeds, online and offline. Anti-Semitism is a global issue. It doesn't stop at borders. The hatred of Jews has been persistent for decades. It even exists in places where no Jews live. Jews worldwide have become increasingly afraid to express their identity or practice their religion freely, amid fear that violence may be directed towards them. Yet, living free from fear and persecution is a fundamental human right. Thus, anti-Semitism is a human rights issue and must be addressed as such. The United Nations is the main multilateral intergovernmental body working to uphold human rights around the world, and it must become a leader on the issue. For many years, the World Jewish Congress has been advocating for anti-Semitism to be at the forefront of the United Nations agenda. I'm now going to give you a brief overview over how this event is going to unfold. It will be divided into 3 parts. We will begin with opening remarks by high-level representatives. Thereafter, we will hold a discussion with 5 experts from the United Nations and the European Union. After the discussion, we will open the floor to questions from the audience. You can send us your questions during the event. You can find a section similar to the chat where you can insert your questions. Finally, we will view pledges submitted to us by member states ahead of this event. You can find these pledges and additional information on the event on the website dedicated to this event. We will be updating the website after the event, so please feel free to visit. Now I have the honor to present to you the first part of this high-level event. We will now hear opening remarks by German Ambassador Michaela Küchler, who is currently chairing the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Thereafter, we will hear remarks from World Jewish Congress President, Ambassador Ronald S. Lauder, which will be read by Mr. Maram Stern, Executive Vice President of the World Jewish Congress. In the following, opening remarks will be given by Mrs. Tatiana Valovaya, Director General of the United Nations at Geneva, Mrs. Audrey Azoulay, Director General of the UNESCO, Mr. Miguel Moratinos, High Representative for the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations, and Ambassador Gilad Erdan, Permanent Representative of Israel to the United Nations.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation to this esteemed assembly. With the United Nations now in its 75th year, we are reminded of all that led to its foundation, of how its origins are tied, without any doubt, to the devastating experience of the Holocaust and the Second World War. From this utter destruction, the UN emerged not only as a beacon of hope, but also as the result of a shared understanding that such a forum was necessary for the maintenance of international peace and security. Today, we are reminded of the importance of international cooperation, of multilateralism, of what we can achieve when we work together. But we also know that this international order, that fundamental human rights, need our strong and unwavering support in order to be maintained. So today we are also reminded of the work that lies ahead. This year of commemoration is set against the backdrop of the coronavirus pandemic and the multiple crises it has brought about. Of course, it is still too early to know the full extent of the pandemic's effects. However, we see it accompanied by the erosion of democratic values, the rise of conspiracy myth, and widespread economic hardship. In short, we see the development of conditions which are ripe for anti-Semitism to thrive. Though anti-Semitism has been on the rise for years, we are now at a critical juncture. The way we respond to this moment will determine the safety not only of the world's Jewish communities, but also of the viability of the world's pluralistic, democratic societies. Anti-Semitism is a global challenge that requires a global response. It neither stops at national borders, nor does it exist in only one language. This is why the current effort by the United Nations and the World Jewish Congress to further the discussion on anti-Semitism is so important. Deepening cooperation in this regard is a priority for the German EU presidency and for the German presidency of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA. For the last 20 years, the IHRA has united governments and experts to strengthen, advance, and promote Holocaust education, remembrance, and research worldwide. Anti-Semitism is not only an international problem, however. It is also an adaptable one. Anti-Semitic conspiracy myths are malleable and are easily repackaged to fit the times. We see this now during the coronavirus pandemic, for example. But the way anti-Semitism is manifested also morphs. Today's fight against anti-Semitism exists in a world where Holocaust denial and distortion are also on the rise. Whether online or off, whether intentional or not, Holocaust denial and distortion chip away at what we know to be historical truth. They allow anti-Semitism to inch towards the mainstream. The issue of Holocaust distortion in particular, because it is more difficult to identify, requires special attention. For this reason, the German presidency of the IHRA has established a global task force against Holocaust distortion to identify and promote strategies for countering distortion. Similarly to anti-Semitism, it is essential that we not only raise awareness of the dangers of distortion, but also that we can better identify and respond to it when it appears. The IRA is therefore developing recommendations for policymakers to strengthen awareness of distortion, its forms and challenges in addressing it. At the core of this effort is the recognition that this too is an international challenge. To this end, the task force works closely with the United Nations, UNESCO, the European Commission and other international organizations, as well as the IRA's membership. The fight against anti-Semitism, against Holocaust denial and distortion, requires building a shared understanding of what anti-Semitism is, of its mechanisms, of its disastrous effects. Practical tools like the IRA's 3 working definitions of anti-Semitism, of Holocaust denial and distortion, and of anti-Gypsyism, anti-Roma discrimination provide mutual starting points for discussion. They serve as educational and awareness-raising tools, sensitizing individuals and institutions to the existence of these phenomena and the mechanisms behind them. No one country or organization can arrive there alone. History has taught us what can happen when anti-Semitism reaches the mainstream. Anti-Semitism is not a Jewish issue. It is an issue for all societies in which it grows. It undermines common values of human rights and democracy. Together, let us build a stronger and broader coalition to stop it. In this way, we can work towards a world that remembers the Holocaust, towards a world without genocide. This is a world of pluralistic, democratic values, a world where anti-Semitism has no place.
Excellencies, esteemed panelists and dear viewers, let me thank Ambassador Michaela Küchler, a friend who I'm bothering too much and who hopefully will remain a friend. Thank you to another friend, Ambassador Christoph Heusgen, the permanent representative of Germany to the United Nations, for leading this event with the World Jewish Congress. And thank you to all other co-sponsoring member states. The World Jewish Congress has been working to eliminate anti-Semitism from our world since its founding in 1936. Regrettably, anti-Semitism remains and constantly adapts itself to the changing environment. Every opinion poll and study conducted over the last few years, which I'm presented with, have painted a dark picture of the increase in anti-Semitic sentiment and perception. Particularly during the COVID-19, ancient anti-Semitic views seem born again, strengthened by conspiracy myth and religious intolerance. It is important to understand that hateful discourse that is directed against Jewish people will also expand to other members of society and threaten the basic fabrics of modern democracy. Anti-Semitism is a global issue that crosses borders, continents, and time. No country is immune, even those without any Jewish population. The United Nations has a unique responsibility to safeguard the Jewish people and to combat anti-Semitism whenever and wherever it may arise. There has been some progress. The Secretary General has been more vocal in condemning anti-Semitic incidents. The Special Rapporteurs on freedom of religion and on racism have published relevant reports calling on the UN and all governments to take action. UNESCO together with the World Congress and other partners, have made significant efforts to combat anti-Semitism through education. The UN Holocaust Program is also committed to advancing Holocaust remembrance. Events have taken place in New York, Geneva, and Paris to raise awareness about the growing threat of anti-Semitism, including an informal meeting of the General Assembly on combating anti-Semitism and other forms of racism and hate in June 2019. And more recently, the UN Secretary General appointed Mr. Miguel Moratinos, the High Representative of the United Nations Alliance of Civilization, as UN Secretary General focal point on anti-Semitism. While we welcome all these developments, the UN must do more. It must streamline the combating of anti-Semitism through a system-wide response using a human rights-based approach. Properly addressing the scourge requires holistic action involving in a multi-pronged response that needs involvement of UN system as a whole. Here are some ideas on how this can be done. Anti-Semitism should be incorporated in all relevant deliberation as a standalone issue so it can be properly addressed and combated. The UN needs to adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IRA, working definition of anti-Semitism, an important step to identify and combat this phenomenon and use this as a guide for its work on the topic. And it's high time the UN adopt a resolution on fighting anti-Semitism. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights must have a more sustained focus and forceful approach to combating this hatred. All relevant special procedures, mechanisms should continue to vigorously monitor and report anti-Semitic manifestation. UNESCO and the UN Holocaust Program should continue intensify their work on Holocaust education and education against anti-Semitism. Last but not least, the UN agencies' reports resolution must cease to treat the Jewish state, Israel, with such a flagrant bias. I wish to thank all member states which have submitted a pledge to ensure that the anti-Semitism will become a priority on the UN global agenda. I look forward to fruitful discussion and wish to thank you all again for your participation in this event. Thank you very much.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to warmly thank the World Jewish Congress and the Permanent Mission of Germany to the United Nations in New York for organizing this high-level side event dedicated to the role of the United Nations in combating anti-Semitism. It is my great pleasure to address this important and timely event. Like all forms of intolerance and discrimination, anti-Semitism has a profound impact on societies. Intolerance and discrimination indeed threaten not only the security of individuals and communities, but also prevent the full realization of fundamental human rights and undermine democratic values and social cohesion. In recent years, the changing geopolitical climate and media environment had led to a situation where open anti-Semitism is no longer confined to extremist circles, but has become increasingly mainstream. As United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has warned, the COVID-19 pandemic continues to unleash a tsunami of hate and xenophobia, scapegoating, and scaremongering. In particular, the worrying rise in anti-Semitic rhetoric online and in the media around the world during the pandemic reinforces the imperious need for global cooperation to fight this scourge. Intolerance and discrimination also continue fueling violent extremism, terrorism, and criminality. Countering these negative trends through promoting dialogue, mutual respect, and understanding must remain a high priority for the international community in its efforts to ensure peace and stability. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the United Nations is fully engaged in combating anti-Semitism as well as all forms of discrimination and intolerance based on religion or belief. In his capacity as United Nations focal point designated by the Secretary General to monitor anti-Semitism and enhance a system-wide response, the High Representative for the United Nations Alliance of Civilization, Mr. Miguel Moratinos, has bolstered the United Nations efforts to fight anti-Semitism and discrimination. The United Nations response is now wide-reaching and takes place across UN agencies. For example, the UN System-Wide Strategy and Plan of Action on Hate Speech, launched in 2019, is now being implemented with a view to effectively address the root causes and drivers of hate speech. Also, the United Nations Plan of Action to safeguard religious sites, spearheaded by the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations, provides an overarching framework to support national efforts to protect religious sites and enable worshippers to observe religious rituals safely. Furthermore, in a significant shift in 2019, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, Mr. Ahmed Shahid, published the first UN Human Rights Report to the General Assembly entirely dedicated to the fight against anti-Semitism. In this report, the Special Rapporteur outlined several concrete recommendations for action and urged Member States to adopt a human rights-based approach in combating anti-Semitism, as should be done in combating all forms of religious intolerance. Anti-Semitism and intolerance can be unlearned. Education is indeed one of the best tools at our disposal to prevent all forms of intolerance and discrimination, to defend fundamental freedoms, and to ensure that human rights are respected everywhere. Stepping up efforts to address anti-Semitism through education is therefore required. The UN is also increasingly active on this front. For instance, the organization is leading important work to prevent anti-Semitism and discrimination, including through Holocaust education and guidelines for policymakers and educators. Through specific programs, UNESCO is also mobilizing member states in fight against all forms of intolerance. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in these deeply challenging times, combating anti-Semitism, bigotry, and hatred in all its forms require greater solidarity and a firm commitment from all. The United Nations will continue to be in the forefront of these efforts. Thank you very much.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank the World Jewish Congress and the Permanent Mission of the Federal Republic of Germany to the United Nations for bringing us together today. Thanks to them, today, we stand together, albeit online, united around shared values, placing the fight against anti-Semitism and all forms of racism and discrimination at the heart of our action for peace. The United Nations system was born on the ashes of the Second World War, when the world was forced to face the horrors of the Holocaust. The Nuremberg trials, which began just 75 years ago, acknowledged the notion of a crime against humanity and made it imprescriptible. In doing so, they showed us the way forward. In 1948, the United Nations adopted the Genocide Convention, giving humanity the weapons to fight these destructive forms of hatred. Because anti-Semitism does not only harm Jewish people, it also undermines human rights in general. Fighting anti-Semitism therefore means defending fundamental freedoms. It means defending the dignity of all human beings. This is why the war against anti-Semitism cannot and should not be waged by Jewish institutions alone. The entire international community must take action. UNESCO, with its mandate on education, is at the forefront of international efforts to combat anti-Semitism. In 2018, working with the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, we launched guidelines to fight anti-Semitism through education, the first publication of this kind by a UN agency, translated in 9 languages. Also in 2018, we organized a high-level event on the margins of the United Nations General Assembly in the presence of the Secretary General, in order to harness the power of education in preventing all forms of racism and discrimination through the lens of our work on anti-Semitism. We know that fighting prejudice, respecting difference, appreciating diversity are values that can be learned. Yet, this requires special skills from teachers and educators to sharpen young people's critical thinking, to promote constructive political and ethical engagement in societies. This is at the core of our partnership with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. Next week, UNESCO and the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights are launching a new framework curriculum to help teachers, teacher trainers, and school directors respond to the rising anti-Semitism in schools. Anti-Semitism also needs to be fought through communication and information. A few months ago, we launched a communications campaign countering conspiracy theories on social media, developed in partnership with the European Commission and Twitter. I am also pleased to announce that we are preparing a new initiative to map Holocaust denial and distortion online and launch educational material with the support of the World Jewish Congress that I thank. And because our efforts need to be part of a system, since last year we have trained 130 policymakers from more than 60 countries on tangible ways of fighting anti-Semitism. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, firm action is also needed from member states to protect Jewish communities and safeguard universal human rights. Anti-Semitic violence is never an isolated act. It is always an indicator of underlying societal problems. Anti-Semitism feeds violent extremist ideologies, online and offline. It builds on Holocaust denial and Holocaust distortion. This is why anti-Semitism must be confronted head-on, without naivety and with perseverance. Because this fight is one that concerns all of humanity. It is our responsibility, it is our collective duty, and we must all bear it. This is UNESCO's message. In these times of fear, of anxiety all around the world, it's a message that I think has never been so important. I thank you for your commitment and attention.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, it's a pleasure to be addressing this important and timely topic, and I want to thank the Permanent Mission of Germany and the World Jewish Congress for convening this meeting that is focused on the role of the United Nations in combating anti-Semitism. COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare the fissures and holes in societies, Racism is one of those features. It was manifested in anti-Semitism, and anti-Asian and anti-Black, Islamophobia, and all forms of discrimination and related intolerance. However, this hate speech phenomenon has existed and persisted even before the pandemic at an alarming rate. Neo-Nazis and white supremacists are expanding their outreach, spreading their twisted and poisonous ideologies online and offline through mainstream media platforms, but especially on the dark web. Anti-Semitic attacks were not only verbal, but also physical, when we have seen Jewish murder in synagogues and other public places and their graveyards desecrated by haters. All this is an affront to the right of everyone to freedom of religion and belief and the freedom of practicing that right without fear. This right is rooted in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Following the important report of the Special Rapporteur of Freedom, my dear friend Dr. Ahmed Sahid, the United Nations Secretary General has designated me since February 2020 to be the UN focal point to monitor anti-Semitism and to enhance a system-wide response to anti-Semitism. I have been reaching out to Jewish organizations and UN relevant entities and bodies, and I plan to convene a meeting that will also involve like-minded member states to create synergy between relevant stakeholders and enhance a system-wide response based on a human rights approach. I see here many areas that we can tap into together, such as, first, enforcing mechanisms for monitoring and reporting anti-Semitism. I see that one of the challenges here is the absence of an international agreeable definition of anti-Semitism, which hinders the identification and reporting of acts of verbal or physical that are considered anti-Semitic. I plan to work on having an agreement and definition of anti-Semitism within the UN based on the IHRA definition, which constitutes a real basis to start from. Secondly, continue to engage and collaborate with social media companies, including Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. We have recently taken a step to remove egregious anti-Semitic content and close their author's account. However, there have been other cases of inconsistencies, and we need to continue this engagement and identify the red lines within the framework of international human rights law. Thirdly, governments, which have the primary responsibility to protect its citizens, are encouraged to take a robust approach to combating hate speech, but within the framework of international human rights law, which call on government to prohibit speech where it amounts to advocacy of religious hatred that constitute incitement to hostility, discrimination, or violence. Fourth, peer-to-peer education to law enforcement and teachers. When equipped with knowledge, political parties, groups, and movements, public officials will be better enabled to undertake their responsibility in combating and curbing such crime. Fifth, developing global citizenship education program with focus on anti-Semitism and all other forms of discrimination based on race, religion, belief, or ethnicity. Mainstreaming, finally, combating anti-Semitism within the UN system. UNOSC, United Nations Alliance Organization, will start doing that of the new interaction across our priority areas with particular focus on youth. In this context, I was very encouraged by the progress that substantive steps that many European countries have taken in combating anti-Semitism, such as the growing number of countries endorsing the IHRA definition and the appointment of envoys and coordinators to oversee efforts in combating anti-Semitism. Combating hate speech, upholding the right of all to exercise their religion and belief freely and safely is also a priority for the United Nations. To this end, the Secretary General launched in 2019 the Strategy and Plan of Action of Hate Speech and the UN Plan of Action to Safeguard Religious Rights. Both plans complement each other. And the United Nations General Assembly also adopted Resolution 60-7, will reject any denial of Holocaust as an historical event, either in full or in part. Resolution 61-253 5. Condemns any denial of Holocaust and urges all member states unreservedly to reject any denial of the Holocaust. My dear friend, distinguished guest, anti-Semitism has been often described as the oldest hatred. I started by stressing that anti-Semitism must be understood in the broader context of racism and other forms of hatred and intolerance towards other faith communities. I would like to conclude by quoting the late Chief Rabbi of the United Kingdom, Jonathan Sachs, who has famously said, "The hate that begins with Jews never ends there." I thank you very much.
Ambassador Kuchler, Ambassador Lauder, Ambassador Heusgen, High Representative Moratinos, distinguished guests. I want to thank the World Jewish Congress, the German Mission, and our other co-sponsors for hosting this important event. As we face a rising wave of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic attacks, the UN must speak out clearly and implement a true zero-tolerance policy. Dr. Shahid's report and the appointment of High Representative Moratinos as focal point on anti-Semitism are important milestones in the UN fight against anti-Semitism. I thank the Secretary General for his commitment to combating this ancient form of bigotry. However, there is more we should be doing. The UN must adopt and implement a definition of anti-Semitism to be more effective. The UN must make it clear to anyone who wants to use its platforms to broadcast anti-Semitic messages in any guise that they are no longer welcome at this institution. The UN must make it clear that it will not fund organizations that include even one word of bigotry or any attempt to delegitimize Israel's existence. Zero tolerance must really mean zero tolerance. Anti-Semitism is like a cancer. If it isn't cut out, it spreads and becomes deadly. Every joke, every unintentional comment, every stereotypical image of Jews advances this process. Today, the internet and social media allow anti-Semitic content to spread faster than ever before. That is why the UN should encourage these companies to monitor and remove anti-Semitic content from their platforms. Anti-Semitism is not always obvious. Some who seek to harm the Jewish people try and hide their bigotry. For example, behind the mask, a report I initiated as Minister of Strategic Affairs revealed how the BDS movement hides behind purported liberal values and human rights while disseminating blatant anti-Semitic content. Unfortunately, these tactics exist at the UN too. Countries conceal bigoted tropes in their remarks at the GA. Israel's legitimacy and right to exist are regularly questioned by UN bodies. If we allow anti-Semitism to go uncontested, we run the risk that more people will believe the lies. This will put Jewish lives in danger, and we know it never ends with the Jews. We must speak out together against anti-Semitic rhetoric. Israel must not be left alone to call out anti-Semitism at the UN. Only when all member states join the call can we truly say that the UN has a zero-tolerance policy against anti-Semitism.
Thank you very much for the opening remarks. We will now proceed with the panel discussion. I would like to introduce you now to our 5 panelists who are all professionals in the international field. We hope that the conversation will allow us to better understand where we are now, what challenges we are facing, and what the possible solutions are. I'm honored to welcome Dr. Ahmed Shahid, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, Mrs. Katharina von Schnurbein, the European Commission Coordinator on Combating Antisemitism, Professor Yuval Shani, Vice Chair of the United Nations Human Rights Committee, Mrs. Tracy Peterson, Program Manager of the Holocaust and United Nations Outreach Program in the Department of Global Communications, and last but not least, Mr. Karel Fracapane, UNESCO Senior Project Officer at the Division for Inclusion, Peace, and Sustainable Development. Thank you again for being here with us today and for being strong World Jewish Congress partners on this issue and on many other issues. More information on the panelists can be found on the website dedicated to this event. I would like to start with Ahmed. Ahmed, last year you wrote a first ever groundbreaking UN report on anti-Semitism. The report states, and I quote, "Anti-Semitism is toxic to democracy and mutual respect of citizens and threatens all societies in which it goes unchallenged." Ahmed, could you please tell us what were the main observations and recommendations coming out from this report?
Thank you, Keila, for inviting me, and thank you, and really happy to be here with all the esteemed panelists this afternoon. Well, you know, the main thrust of my report was to argue the case that we must address anti-Semitism as a global challenge, as a global scourge, and that we must use a human rights framework to do that. And I identified many challenges along the way. One of the key issues, of course, being the issue of a definition of anti-Semitism, because this affected our awareness of what the phenomenon was about. It affected our ability to collect data about anti-Semitic hate crimes and prejudice. It was therefore undermined our efforts to respond to this. So I recommended that states adopt the IHRA working definition with its examples, because they clarify the different ways in which the phenomenon manifests itself. And then I had specific recommendations for both online and offline challenges and for different actors. But the key thing that really disturbed me was the alarming rate at which anti-Semitism was rising, and of course has been a further upsurge this year with the COVID pandemic. But also the level of violence that was accompanied by the manifestations of anti-Semitic hatred. This is quite disturbing. And of course, if you compare the amount of incidents, and of course, you know, the community in size, as it were, then you can see how, as an individual, you would face that on a daily basis. So this was the scale, the fact that online, offline incidents were rising, and there was a need to respond to this. And I also had recommendations for the UN. My main concern was the UN was disengaged from the issue. I'd earlier used the word scandalously underserved the community. I think there's a huge gap between what the UN can do and what it's doing. And in some parts of the UN, it itself becomes a disseminator of anti-Semitic prejudice and hatred. So I have recommendations for the UN, and I'm happy that one has been adopted. I hope more are adopted. I had specific recommendations for states beyond adopting the IHRA working definition, because the left-wing version of anti-Semitism or new anti-Semitism is a really huge challenge that needs to be addressed. I also had some positive ones about UNESCO's work. The need to use education as a tool to promote awareness about different ways, communities exist, and certainly to combat anti-Semitism through that. So politicians, civil society actors, businesses, tech companies, educators, all have to have a role to play in combating anti-Semitism as a global problem.
Thank you, Ahmed. I would like to come back to the point what the UN does against anti-Semitism and what more it can do later on in the discussion. But now I would like to turn to Katharina. Katharina, the European Commission was one of the first intergovernmental organizations that created the position of a coordinator on combating anti-Semitism, a role in which you have excelled. Katharina, could you please share with us the main goals and measures the European Union has adopted to combat anti-Semitism?
Yes, Gita, it's a real pleasure to be with you and all the other esteemed panelists here today. Thank you very much to the World Jewish Congress for putting this together and the German mission. Well, we started working on this some time ago, but in 2015, this coordinator post was created in order to recognize, first of all, the threat that Ahmed has already described very well, and I fully subscribe to his analysis. And on the other side, to create a focal point for the Jewish communities, but also to ensure that we look at policies in a holistic way. So my responsibility when I came into office was to reach out to Jewish communities across Europe, to Jewish organizations as well, on national level, on European level, and to ensure that their voices are being heard. And I believe that, frankly, we did not exactly know what was going on, how severe the situation was, and also I believe we were not aware of the diversity of the Jewish communities and the different threats that Jewish communities face in different parts of Europe. So to have this holistic view was important, and a lot of my time went into reaching out to Jewish communities and listening to their concerns and their ideas also. Secondly, we my office advises the political level of the European Commission. President von der Leyen has been very clear in her determination to address anti-Semitism. In fact, 10 days into her mandate in December 2019, she made an important speech called After Halle, From Words to Action, in which she committed to really addressing this in a forceful way. And she appointed Vice President Skinas on the political level, who is responsible for promoting the European way of life. And I think that the fact that it is part of this portfolio is very important. Jewish life is a part of Europe, and that's our overarching goal, to keep it like that. The idea that Jews see their future in Europe and that they don't sit on packed suitcases is unfortunately the case in some places at the moment. So that is the second aspect, to ensure that there is political action. And then there is, on the other side, also the very concrete policy initiatives that we must take, that we must propose and prepare. It has to do a lot with outreach and collaboration with the different departments of the European Commission, with also international organizations. And in fact, we had, and I was with Ahmed last year in June together at the informal General Assembly discussing anti-Semitism for the first time, where the EU was one of the sponsors, together with Israel, the US, and Canada. And this followed several other events that we had beforehand. So the outreach and coordination with other international organizations is also very important, to not reinvent the wheel, but to use our different strengths and bring them together in order to really create synergies in addressing this scourge.
Thank you, Katharina. I would like now to turn to Yuval. Yuval, you are Vice President and an expert member of the Human Rights Committee, a body that reviews the compliance of 173 state parties to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Could you please explain the role of treaty bodies, and especially the Human Rights Committee, in the United Nations efforts to combat anti-Semitism and other types of hate?
Well, thank you, Gila, and I want to also congratulate the organizers and greet my fellow panelists, and thank you for inviting me. The Human Rights Committee is one of 10 treaty bodies that are responsible for monitoring the implementation of 9 different global treaties on human rights, And the Human Rights Committee is entrusted with monitoring implementation, with, as you said, with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is a very far-reaching covenant that deals with many aspects that are intimately related with the fight against anti-Semitism. It is a treaty that prohibits discrimination. It is a treaty that prohibits violence to person or life. It is a treaty that protects freedom of religion. And it is also a treaty that, whereas it protects freedom of expression, also prohibits advocacy of hatred. So it is really an excellent legal framework to deal with a very wide gamut of legal issues, including the fight against anti-Semitism. And it does its implementation work through two specific mechanisms. One is the periodic review of state reports. So every state in the world has to report every few years to the committee on the manner of its implementation of its covenant obligations. And it is also open for individual communications coming from about 2/3 of the state parties' residents in connection with such implementation. Now, in its actual practice, I would say, and we will get to this, I guess, further down the discussion, that the committee has been greatly underutilized as far as issues relating anti-Semitism go. The committee does confront in specific reviews of countries occasionally information that about rise in anti-Semitism, and it does confront states and does request states to report on planned activities in the field. And every year it issues a number of what we call concluding observations in this regard. It is also reviewing specific complaints, both by victims of hatred, but also by individuals whose speech was limited because they engage in hate speech. And in that respect, they do make, the committee does make, in specific cases, a very important normative contribution. But by and large, I would say that the committee, with regard to anti-Semitism, unlike with regard to other topics, human rights related topics, where the committee is receiving a very steady flow of information and complaints from victims and from groups involved in advocacy, I would say that anti-Semitism doesn't get the same kind of attention, unfortunately, by the different stakeholders before the committee. And I do hope, and I do call on the partners who are in the room and on Zoom and beyond to engage more closely with the committee, and we can discuss further on how this could be done better. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuval. We would love to hear what your insights are and what you think could be done by the committee to better address anti-Semitism. I would now like to turn to Tracy, who heads the United Nations Holocaust Outreach Program, which was established in 2005, making it one of the longest running UN initiatives on the topic. Dear Tracy, how would you evaluate the impact of the program so far?
Well, I wanted to congratulate the organizers of today's important discussion and to thank you very much for inviting me to speak on the panel and to share with you the work done to combat anti-Semitism by the United Nations through its mandated program on outreach about the Holocaust. And as you've quite rightly said, Gila, this is a long-running program established through Resolution A67 in 2005 by the General Assembly. And that resolution was obviously an expression of the consensus reached by member states. It was also a reflection of what the unique structure of the United Nations can give rise to, as well as an expression of the United Nations organization of putting into action ideas of freedom, rights, equality, equity, and dignity, and putting into action the principles of its founding documents, the Charter of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so you have asked me specifically to talk a little bit about the impact, but I think it was useful just to say a little more about what gave rise to the outreach program, because I think it speaks to what the United Nations as an organization of member states is able to achieve. The United Nations outreach program on the Holocaust is part of the Department for Global Communications, which is part of the Secretariat. And our job in the Secretariat is to implement the mandates, the asks, if you like, of the member states. And so I think, let me quickly talk a little bit about what we've been doing. So since its establishment in 2005, the program has responded to meet its mandate, and its mandate was to mobilize civil society, to create awareness of Holocaust commemoration and education in order to support the prevention of genocide. And so what has the program been doing in all this time? It has organized numerous activities, including film screenings, discussion papers from leading academics, educational resources, workshops for teachers and students, and webinars. Very importantly, the program has built partnerships across the United Nations organization, including our rich and rewarding partnership with UNESCO. And I'm delighted that Mr. Fracapani will be speaking after me, because they really have done extraordinary work, and it is a delight to be able to work with them. With intergovernmental organizations, and such as the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and educational institutions around the world, from the Holocaust and Genocide Foundation in South Africa to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and so on. And we have attempted to amplify best practice where possible. The program has been able to extend outreach globally through its relationship with the United Nations information officers and resident coordinators. And the program provides support to the information officers that are around the world in their program of Holocaust commemoration and outreach. Our partnerships with these field officers are invaluable, because the information officers, and I'm speaking about countries that are not within Europe, countries that do not necessarily have an automatic connection to the history of the Holocaust, and so therefore don't necessarily consider a connection between contemporary expressions of anti-Semitism to the past expressions of anti-Semitism. I just want to pause there just to say Dr. Shahid, in his report, speaks about how in contemporary anti-Semitism, those anti-Semitic tropes that the Nazis deployed with devastating effect, building on, of course, ancient a history of ancient anti-Semitism, that those tropes from the Nazis are still being deployed today. And so this is why it's so important that our program is supporting the information officers in the field, so that they can in turn provide their public with information and education about the Holocaust and also commemoration. Why are information officers so important, Gila? It's because, you see, they're able to work within the local context. They have local partners, they can work in the local languages, and I must say that they receive support from the local missions, various governments that really make it a partnership in bringing about Holocaust commemoration and education. And they also, of course, assist us, and this is something else that the program has been instrumental in doing and was tasked to do, in making educational resources accessible in obviously the 6 official United Nations languages, but also in other languages, for example, in Kiswahili, in Azeri, in Portuguese, in German, Polish, and counting.
Thank you, Tracy. Thank you.
I just need to say one more thing there.
Okay.
This year has been challenging, as it has been for every other organization that has been involved in commemoration or education about the Holocaust. But I have to say that COVID-19 has forced our program to pivot to an online program. And in the last handful of months, we have tripled the number of activities that we have done. We have radically enlarged our footprint. And so that is a silver lining in the darkness that COVID has imposed on us. Thank you so much, Gil.
Thank you, Tracy, for sharing your work with us. You've mentioned a partnership with the UNESCO. So I would like to ask Karel. Karel, UNESCO has been one of the first UN agencies to start programs specifically on Holocaust education and against anti-Semitism. Could you tell us how you would evaluate your initiative so far?
Thank you very much, Gila. I want to thank the World Jewish Congress and the Permanent Mission of Germany to the UN to start with for organizing this important and timely event. So as you said, and as Tracy has mentioned, UNESCO has had a program on Holocaust education that has been running for many years now in partnership with the UN program. And thank you, Tracy, for your kind words. But we have developed also, in addition to this, a few years later, another specific program on addressing anti-Semitism as it manifests itself today, contemporary issues. And therefore, we've also been approaching the issue from the perspective of the prevention of violent extremism, bringing some focus on anti-Semitism as a standalone issue. It's also something that we're trying to do now as we are implementing the UN strategy and plan of action against hate speech, making sure that the issue is the object of attention by member states in the framework of this very broad program. Our approach so far has been very concrete. As the educational agency of the United Nations, we focused very much on technical issues relating to educating about and against anti-Semitism. The first priority for us was to raise awareness of the problem amongst member states at UNESCO and within the UN system to make sure that the issue of anti-Semitism is properly acknowledged by public authorities and addressed as such, and not left, like it is often the case, to the responsibility of Jewish communities. It means also that that anti-Semitism should be understood in its own specificities in regard to other forms of intolerance and discrimination, but also in regard to its own contemporary and historical features. That meant for us to highlight the fact that this is a global phenomenon, regardless of whether or not a Jewish population is present, and even if trends may differ from a region or a country to another. And this is, of course, all the more relevant now, as shown by the recent spur of hate speech during the COVID-19 pandemic. It meant also for us demonstrating that anti-Semitism is a systemic phenomenon and that it should be understood as a symptom of broader structural problems, regressive tendencies in societies in which it strives, that it actually has a broad destructive impact beyond the Jewish communities that are primarily affected. So we've organized advocacy events to demonstrate this. So to say, we've done one important one in 2018, which the Director General has mentioned earlier, on the power of education for countering anti-Semitism in the sidelines of the United Nations General Conference, in the presence of the Secretary General. 1 year later, with the Special Rapporteur Ahmed Shaid, and with the United Nations Department of Global Communications, with Tracy, with the participation of the UN Office of Counterterrorism, who's also organized a joint event in the margins of the General Assembly to call on member states to invest in education to tackle anti-Semitism. A second priority has been to try to strengthen cooperation with other international bodies, which is the object of the discussion today, obviously. We've done so with the OSCE, Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. Most of what UNESCO has developed has been developed jointly with the OSCE ODIHR. That is important to note, because we could indeed gather resources and our different areas of expertise working together to combat anti-Semitism. It was important for us, by the same token, of course, to reinforce our partnership with specialized organizations and also with Jewish organizations, primarily the World Jewish Congress. From a programmatic perspective, our first priority was to develop technical guidance for education stakeholders. There was already quite some materials available at national level and primarily for teachers, but there was no holistic approach from a policy perspective on how to address anti-Semitism through education, throughout the education system. How do you teach about anti-Semitism? What are the guiding principles of education so anti-Semitism can be combated through education? And how do you prevent and react to anti-Semitic incidents in educational environments? So we wanted to sort of have a holistic approach, and that's why in 2018 we developed this policy guide together with OSCE ODIHR. It was the first of its kind, and I should say it was the first ever publication on anti-Semitism in the UN system. Now we are also trying to concentrate on teacher training institutions, because of course teachers are the end target, so to say, to us, teachers and pupils. What's happening in the classroom, the teacher needs to be trained. So there's a lot of professional development that is needed at this level. So we are launching next week, together with OSCE ODIHR, a set of curricula for teacher training institutions, and primary schools, for primary education, for secondary education, for vocational education, and also some guidelines for school directors on how to address anti-Semitism in their schools. And last, and that was really also another very, very pragmatic, or I would say practical approach from UNESCO in terms of education. It was to build the capacity of education stakeholders. So we have the technical guidance, we also train people, basically. And we've done that with senior civil servants from ministries of education. So far, we've reached out to 64 countries in all regions of the world, all regions, from the United Kingdom to Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Armenia, Mauritania, Turkey, Uruguay, Russia, Sri Lanka. We've had trainings for civil servants from these countries, people that were in charge of human rights education, of the prevention of violent extremism, of teacher training, of curriculum development, this sort of people. Now, what we're trying to do is to work with the most interested countries, and we're setting priorities with some of them in order to work at national and sub-regional level, so we can actually develop this training closer to the field, so to say. And what we will be doing in the coming weeks is to develop, because of the pandemic situation that sort of prevents us, of course, from doing training in the field, to develop an online course on anti-Semitism, and so we can continue that work on the long term. These were our priorities.
Thank you, Karel. So now we've talked about your work in addressing anti-Semitism and raising awareness, and I would like to know, what do you think could be measures that the UN could be taking to strengthen its role in combating anti-Semitism, so that the fight against anti-Semitism could be better prioritized within the UN system? I would like to start with Ahmed. You have been talking about the gap between what the UN does at the moment and what it can do, not only the UN, but also the UN member states. And I would ask you to give us a brief insight about what you see as the role of the UN member states.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. Thank you. Thank you for that question. I think there's a lot the UN can do. Of course, I want to commend what UNESCO is doing at the present time through its education and awareness raising programs. I also want to compliment the Secretary General for appointing Mr. Moratinos as a high-level focal point look at the issue. But there's a lot more that can be done. It can vary from things like mandatory training on say, awareness about Holocaust and so on, to the member states, the staff of the UN, including their own training on the IRA working definition. So they become more aware that in their work, when they come across anti-Semitic behavior and prejudice. So training for staff is important. But at the institutional level, again, UN needs to look at what it's doing. I understand that every state in the UN should be held accountable, and by that yardstick, so should Israel. But right now, Israel is judged for its mere existence rather than its conduct. So that should change. No country should get judged for its existence, should be judged by its conduct. And in that sense, the fact that there is a permanent focus on Israel in Geneva, and that the focus is disproportionately on one country is an impediment, not just for the work of combating anti-Semitism, but also I think for broader work on human rights as well. So addressing that anti-Israel bias is something the UN should do at institutional level, and states should also recognize what they need to do to address this bias. But beyond that, at the state level, I think all states must adopt, and I think I call on all states to adopt the IRA working definition as an educational tool. That is essential to understand the different ways in which anti-Semitism is manifested, and beyond, and just not just adopt it, but use it as well. So use it for training teachers, training law enforcement, the press, the media as well. So there is a good awareness of what anti-Semitism looks like and when and how to avoid that. This also leads to better data collection at the domestic level when there is anti-Semitism manifested. And that can also therefore lead to better accountability, better redress, justice for those who are victimized by anti-Semitic prejudice. And of course, states can also contribute to better, online engagement, although of course the online dimension is a separate field, but they can encourage various ways of engaging with the manifestation of anti-Semitism on online platforms, empowering society, empowering individuals to report on violations, again, creating awareness on to deal with that. For me, also, there's a scope for bridge building in addressing anti-Semitism. And the UN can be a forum for doing that. I don't mean simply youths here, I also mean more broadly. For example, the WJC, World Jewish Congress, and the Muslim World League engagement in recent years has been very helpful. There should be more of this, because I think we should also call out anti-Semitism in Muslim societies. And this goes beyond leaders like the rule of Iran or Prime Minister Mahathir of Malaysia. It's far more widespread. So we need to be able to engage with grassroots level anti-Semitism to be able to start addressing that. But for me, at the UN level, UN must show leadership, both from the top, which I think now is forthcoming in the form of Secretary General and his efforts, but also through its institutional practices, in the way it deals with Israel, in the way it also recruits its staff and also socializes them to deal with various forms of hatred, including anti-Semitism. And of course, people like myself, rapporteurs and others in the UN system should also be more mindful of how anti-Semitism manifests itself and be prepared to deal with that. This also calls therefore broader engagement with the Jewish organizations. There's been over time, with good reason, I think, a gap between some parts of the UN and the Jewish communities. This has to change, and this requires UN to reach out. It also requires, I think, the communities themselves to recognize there are parts of the UN that can work for them. So I think it requires a number of steps by the UN showing leadership, number of practical measures by states at the national level, and then of course, civil society actors to engage together to build bridges of understanding amongst different communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmed. Thank you very much. I would like to turn to Katarina. Katarina, I am thinking about the European Union Council Declaration on the Fight Against Anti-Semitism, which was passed in 2018. And I was wondering if you could just briefly tell us what you think the United Nations could take from the European Union's approach in tackling anti-Semitism.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's always good to speak after Ahmed, because he's already said a lot of the things that I would have said as well. So it's very good. We are very much aligned on this issue. The Council Declaration 2018 was indeed key to establish basis, political acknowledgement across all member states, adopted by unanimity, to address anti-Semitism in the various forms. So I will give you a few of the most important elements. One has been referred to already in a very positive way also by Ambassador Moratinos, the IRA definition. It's very clear, you can't fight it if you can't define it. We needed a definition, and the European Commission since 2017, so shortly after the IRA adopted it, has been using this definition. And in the declaration, member states commit, for those who have not done so yet, to adopt the IRA definition. So we really expect all member states to adopt this definition in the near future. I believe that the definition has become an instrument, on the one side, to recognize all forms of anti-Semitism as equally pernicious, including also Israel-related anti-Semitism, which is, of course, always the center of the debate, but it's important to be very specific and to know where the red line is crossed, and here the definition can definitely help. And on the other side, as a political expression of the willingness to wanting to address anti-Semitism in a holistic way, no matter what the source is. Is it right-wing extremism? Is it left-wing extremism? Does it come from Islamist extremism? You know, we address it across the board. And I believe the fact that there are several Muslim majority countries like Albania, like Kosovo, like Bahrain, who have now adopted is an enormous step forward, and shows that it can be used when there is sincerity about addressing the issue. So that's one aspect. Secondly, member states committed to adopting national strategies against anti-Semitism. And I think that is an important aspect also when it comes to looking at the complex system of UN member states and how they interact with the UN as an institution itself. So we support member states with a working group in drafting these strategies, in discussing different aspects that should be part of the strategy because they agreed to them in the declaration. One is that we need to ensure security of Jewish communities. This is a specific issue also in Europe, and we know that unless you feel secure, you don't see your future in a certain place. So it is a responsibility of each member state to together with the Jewish communities, make risk assessments, put in place the security, and not make the communities pay for it, but pay for the security of the state as they would for any other community. Secondly, education was mentioned here in different forms with regards to the Holocaust, with regards to anti-Semitism. I would add also with regards to showing the diversity of Jewish life, because in Europe, we have such a small Jewish community because of the Holocaust. So our responsibility is there to support the making aware and showing of the diversity of Jewish life through funding and through different supports of organizations and so on. Then we have the important aspect of wanting to have fact-based policy making, which means on the one side we need surveys. So we did a big survey together with the Fundamental Rights Agency on among the Jewish communities on their perception of anti-Semitism, and we matched that with a Eurobarometer, which was a survey among the general population as to their perception of anti-Semitism. I think it's very important to have these two aspects. Then another aspect that is needed and was already also mentioned is the data collection of anti-Semitic incidents. You need to make it visible in order for the political level to act. And so this is together again with the Fundamental Rights Agency, we gather annually the incidents across Europe, and we still have countries that don't report anything, or the thing is not harmonized. So this is an important aspect that we are also working on. And then I would add another aspect with regards to the fact-based policymaking is also to look into research and the contemporary one as well as the historic one to make sure that we get it right. The fourth aspect is to make anti-Semitism, to recognize that it is a cross-cutting issue, which means we need to address it across policies, which I already mentioned the different aspects, but that means we need to ensure that we bring the different actors on board. So we need to work closely with the ministries of education, with the ministries of interior, with the counterterrorism coordinators, with those who take care of security measures, the police, and so on. So this is also very important to have this decentralized approach, but coordinated approach, and that in the context of mainstreaming, which means using existing structures rather than creating parallel structures, but using the existing structures that there are in the European system, in the national system, and using those instruments and mechanisms to address anti-Semitism, in my view, is much more effective than trying to create other structures. So this is very important. And maybe one final aspect is, we know anti-Semitism needs counter-speech. It's very important to do this online and offline to ensure that there is takedowns, and to ensure that the platforms are being responsibilized, that users are being responsibilized, and that we ensure that anti-Semitism is addressed in the different camps by its own people, because often we have that the left is pointing to the right and the right is pointing to the Muslims, and so we have this perpetuum mobile. And I think it's really important to make sure that we, including ourselves, address anti-Semitism when we hear it in our own environment, and that includes for the European Commission also training for its own staff on contemporary forms of anti-Semitism, but also on the Holocaust and the need for remembrance. So in a nutshell, that's it.
Thank you, Katharina. That is a large variety of measures that could be applied within the UN system as well. Thank you for that. Yuval, you were talking about the work the Human Rights Committee is doing in tackling anti-Semitism, and you said that anti-Semitism could get more attention. I was wondering if you could just very quick tell us, what do you think and how the committees could contribute to strengthening the fight against anti-Semitism at the UN?
Right, thank you. So this really goes to the point made by Katrina about using existing structures. I mean, there is an existing structure. I mean, the Human Rights Committee is an existing structure. I should say there is another committee, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which is an existing structure. These bodies have treaties that protect individuals from hate speech and from anti-Semitic speech, and they could be utilized. I mean, in what way could they be utilized? They're utilized often through civil society that is presenting what we call shadow reports. So when a state is being reviewed, it is very often the practice that we would get a shadow report, namely a report from civil society, that would highlight some problems with the implementation of the relevant treaty. Now, there are areas in which we get a lot of shadow reports. So for instance, there are some very effective shadow reporting with regard to women's rights, with regard to children's rights, with regard to migrants' rights, okay, with regard to conscientious objectors. Unfortunately, there are areas, anti-Semitism being one of them, on which we do not get a lot of shadow reporting. So this is an area where we think that civil societies, but other international organizations and groups could be much more effective in bringing this information before treaty bodies. So for instance, we are getting briefings whenever we review a country. We would get briefing from UNHCR on the refugee situation in that country. Had we gotten briefings from special rapporteurs or working groups or focal points, or even desk officers within the Office of the High Commissioner in Geneva on the anti-Semitism or other discriminated against minorities situation in those countries, that would enable us to focus our attention and also our recommendations. Because once we have the data, and I do subscribe to the point that having the data about the incidence of anti-Semitism, trends in anti-Semitism, manifestations in anti-Semitism, success and failure of different activities by states. This is really for us a critical piece of information for us to be able to extend protection. So in this regard, I think that there is much more work to be done. And I don't think it's only, again, I mean, the UN can do much more in terms of harnessing its different apparatuses in order to collect information and render it accessible across the UN, and in particular, from my point of view, to treaty bodies and other expert mechanisms who are working in this field. But civil society also could do, I guess, much more in order to utilize this machinery. And of course, civil society groups that work with victims could also do much more work in terms of channeling their cases to us, because I think what we offer is not only the ability to provide remedies and recommendations, but also to assist in the development of global standards. So the committee, for instance, when it got Holocaust denial cases, I think it made a very, very important statements on the linkage between Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism, and why Holocaust denial shouldn't be covered by freedom of expression, because in the specific cases that it was brought to our attention, it was simply a proxy for anti-Semitism. And we were able to deal with cases dealing with anti-Semitic speech in school through the need to respect an unbiased environment for students. So we do have the legal tools, but we are like a court in this respect. We are a reactive body, and we need to have the information brought before us through the different channels. I just want to throw in one more comment about the UN and the online, the issue of the online space, where I think here there is a lot of work that could be done from a variety of UN human rights and other bodies in order to foster more specific standards on hate speech and more specific standards specifically on anti-Semitism. This is currently a very significant point in times for online platforms. There is a lot of change. We have seen the very positive developments in Facebook with regard to Holocaust denial or distortion. There is also a new oversight board which has been set up. So this is really a very important point in time. And a body like the UN with its coordinative capabilities can do perhaps much more at this point in time to push normative standards such as the IRA working definition, so as to integrate it also within platform policies. So it's not only the role of the UN in terms of coordinating policies of member states, but also pushing forward vis-a-vis other stakeholders relevant standards in this field. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuval. Thank you very much. Tracy, Yuval was mentioning the linkage between Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism, and you've been telling us about the United Nations Holocaust Outreach Program. Could you just very briefly tell us what you think could be done even more to address and combat anti-Semitism through this program? You have to unmute yourself, Tracy. We can't hear you.
After all these months, I still forget. Thanks, Gila. Yes, well, of course. So I suppose the first bit of information is to say that every bit of work that we have done for the last, since 2005 has been about supporting an understanding of the accurate history, of revealing where the danger of propaganda and of misinformation, disinformation related to the history and how the history played itself out. In concrete terms, we are about to begin work with UNESCO and with the World Jewish Congress on precisely that topic of Holocaust distortion. And there will be more that will come out about that later on. I also think that, what's really important for people to understand, and that's what the program is trying to do, is to pick up on that idea that you, instead of silencing speech, you try and show what the accurate information is. And we do that through trying to have as many opportunities, creating as many opportunities for experts in the field to be able to inform and educate. I know that there is discussion also, just to pick up on the previous speaker, Yuval's comment, there are in place attempts to work with Facebook, for example, on an online to create those norms. But finally, I just wanted to come back to the recommendations for the UN system, just to say, I think there are two things that are really important, is to understand I think what NGOs can do is to also try and explain what the UN is. I think sometimes there's the misperception that the UN is an NGO, and it's not. I think that will be very helpful. Secondly, I think that, what has been expressed through our keynote speakers and through other individuals is that the United Nations has many programs in place, has many initiatives and resolutions that are there that can be used to fight anti-Semitism, and that it is unambiguous, I think, in its position that anti-Semitism is not acceptable, and that we will in the program continue to support initiatives that fight against anti-Semitism within a human rights framework. One way, for example, is to develop an understanding of how anti-Semitism is an expression of racism, as it certainly was during the Holocaust, and so therefore is an attack on the principles of human rights enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Convention of the United Nations. So our program, in short, is part of the UN's expression of its commitment to fighting anti-Semitism and to fighting Holocaust denial and distortion.
Thank you very much, Tracy. Karel, I would like to ask you, you were saying that the UNESCO is establishing partnerships in order to tackle anti-Semitism, and I was wondering how you think that the UNESCO could push other UN agencies to tackle anti-Semitism more seriously.
Thank you, Gila. In a way, I'd like to go back to the event we organized in 2018 and the speech of the Secretary General, which gave a very clear recommendations and, so to say, a roadmap, at least as far as education is concerned. He said, here are the 4 priorities. First, recognize anti-Semitism as a problem to be addressed internationally, and he acknowledged the work of the IRA in that respect. And he said, second, develop educational programs that address anti-Semitism in the framework of a human rights and global citizenship education. Then third, build the capacity of education systems to address anti-Semitism, conspiracy theories, and all other forms of hate speech. Fourth, we must see diversity as a richness. As societies become more multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and multicultural, we must invest more in social cohesion. This is absolutely core to UNESCO's work in education, in communication and information, but also in terms of cultural dialogue. And I want to say that this is our roadmap. And that should be the roadmap also for the UN system when it comes to preventive and educational approaches. This leaves us with a number of challenges, and I think Tracy and Yuval have mentioned them, the issue of hate speech and how do you combat anti-Semitism when it comes to hate speech? How do you equip teachers to deal with these issues is also a major problem. And in that respect, we advocate for more and better media and information literacy. And that's why we are also sort of including the issue of anti-Semitism in the implementation of the UN strategy and plan of action on hate speech. Another important challenge, which Tracy has mentioned, is the issue of Holocaust distortion, more so than Holocaust denial, which is it's a very contemporary issue, and it's a very serious one. When the historical record of the Holocaust is manipulated and most often minimized, of course, to serve political agendas of the time, such as when countries tend to deflect responsibilities of local governments at the time and populations in the perpetration of the genocide. This feeds anti-Semitism. This feeds discourses that have anti-Semitic features. And Tracy mentioned it. This is something that we are working together on in order to sort of map the trends of Holocaust distortion online, and then to develop tools for teachers in that respect. As far as the UN system is concerned now, to answer your question, I mean, of course, we have been advocating for more harmonization of our work. And I say with the OSCE, we've done so very, very efficiently. We're working, of course, with the European Commission on the educational dimension to make sure that our work is more harmonized and there won't be any duplication. This is the way I think we can serve the requests of member states, the demands of member states. And this has been UNESCO's goal all along, to mainstream the issue and to work with member states to address the problem through education. We need concrete supports from member states. And the UN is what member states decide it becomes. You know, we're a reflection of the member states' will in that respect. And therefore, If we are to be efficient, you need and better coordinated within the system, you need very strong political support. Strong political support, that means also public commitment to address the issue and to show that anti-Semitism is just unacceptable. That if you don't make that public commitment to start with, nothing is going to follow. And of course, you need resources, financial resources. And you can say as much as you want that you want UNESCO and the UN and others to work on that, but if you don't finance them, nothing is going to happen. So, so this is quite important. Find resources that are assigned to programs designed to combat anti-Semitism. Eventually, what you want is that young people are aware of anti-Semitism, that they can recognize it, that they are active in combating against it. This is what we call global citizenship, responsible citizenship. So they don't stand by, so they don't stay indifferent. And this requires time, requires money, and this is done through education. It's a long-term endeavor. Last, we need, and here I want to thank again the World Jewish Congress for all that you're doing. We need support from civil society. We need an investment from the civil society and Jewish organization. We need you to engage directly with us on a permanent basis. And the quality of that engagement will reflect upon our programs eventually. This is also, I think, how we will be able to mainstream the issue within the UN system and intensify our work to uphold human rights, which is what we eventually want.
Thank you, Karel. Thank you to all of the panelists for taking your time and for joining us in this discussion. Thank you for your insights and for the fruitful discussion that we had. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. So concerning the questions that we received from the audience, the participants of this panel can see your questions in the chat. And I would like to remind the audience that you can reach the panelists through their official capacities within the UN and the European Union. And I would now like to give the floor to the permanent representative of the United States to the United Nations, Ambassador Kelly Craft.
Thank you so much. The United States recognizes the vital role the UN system can play in engaging with Jewish communities in combating rising anti-Semitism. We appreciate the work of Special Rapporteur Dr. Ahmed Shahid, in particular, his historic 2019 report on combating anti-Semitism to eliminate discrimination and intolerance based on religion or belief, with its excellent practical recommendations. The United States welcomes Secretary General Guterres' senior level UN focal on the issue, which will lead to responsible engagement in anti-Semitism and the response of the UN to this scourge. Thank you. And thank you once again for allowing me to come on today. It was very, very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Thank you again to the panelists for joining us and for the discussion. We will now have the opportunity to view the pledges that have been submitted to us by the member states. And I would like to remind you that you can find these videos and also the pledges that have been submitted to us in writing on the website of this event. So thank you very much. And
hello. At the outset, I would like to thank the World Jewish Congress and the Mission of Germany for bringing us together in convening this important event, co-sponsored also by Albania. Anti-Semitism and other kinds of hate speech and discrimination are an attack on the very essence of our human rights, norms, and principles. As new digital channels are enabling an instant and global dissemination of anti-Semitism, we are faced with unprecedented challenges, and we all need to step up our response. Albania, a country well known for its long-standing tradition of religious harmony, stands ready to offer its contribution. And while we commit that there should be zero tolerance for anti-Semitism, we should also ensure that these statements are accompanied by actions. And Albania walks the talk. In October, the Albanian parliament adopted the working definition of anti-Semitism as defined by the International Alliance for the Remembrance of the Holocaust. Following the adoption of this landmark resolution, on 28 October, Albania's parliament hosted the first ever Balkan Forum against anti-Semitism, thus reaffirming its proactive role as a regional leader in the fight against anti-Semitism. Within the United Nations, Albania has a constructive partnership with the Holocaust and the UN Outreach Program in supporting awareness raising of the dangers of anti-Semitism. Last year, the Mission of Albania, in partnership with the UN Department of Global Communications and the World Jewish Congress, hosted an event at the UN headquarters on the rescuing of Jews in Albania during the Holocaust, recognizing Albania's response as an example of moral courage. Anti-Semitism is not only an attack on Jews, but also on our common universal values. As our Prime Minister Edi Rama put it, anti-Semitism is a threat to our own civilization. In concluding, I would like to emphasize that our common message from both governments and civil society should be loud and clear. Anti-Semitism is socially, politically, and religiously unacceptable. My country stands ready to support initiatives and programs within the UN and in cooperation with like-minded countries to stand up and combat anti-Semitism, as well as other forms of racism, prejudice, and hate. I thank you.
The persecution, eviction, and homicide of European Jews has left us with a devastating legacy. Yet, until today, the traces of anti-Semitism in Austria and Europe have still not been erased. Quite the contrary. Unfortunately, anti-Semitism is on the rise across the globe, not least in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic. Austria has a special responsibility for Jewish life. Therefore, the Austrian government is taking that very serious. This is why today Austria stands at the forefront of the fight against anti-Semitism, against racism and intolerance, and against violent extremism. Only 2 weeks ago, an Islamist terrorist attack struck the heart of Vienna, directly in front of our main synagogue. And it struck the core of our values as an open, diverse and free society. Violent extremism, xenophobia, racism, intolerance and anti-Semitism are rising worldwide. Yet, we are more determined than ever to protect the values of freedom, democracy and human rights that unite us with our partners and the United Nations. Therefore, Austria pledges to develop a comprehensive national strategy to prevent and combat all forms of anti-Semitism in cooperation with representatives of the Jewish community in Austria, with concrete measures to better protect Jewish communities and institutions. To work towards the full implementation of the EU Council Declaration on the Fight Against Anti-Semitism, concluded during Austria's EU presidency in December 2018. To continue its strong engagement to address anti-Semitism and the protection of religious minority as well as violent extremism. In the General Assembly, the Human Rights Council and UNESCO, including cooperations with like-minded states and interested organizations. We have to continue to support United Nations initiatives and events for Holocaust remembrance and education, especially within the framework of UNESCO. And to continue to promote the working definition of anti-Semitism of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which Austria accepted in 2017. We have to further strengthen our forces in the fight against all forms of anti-Semitism. Thank you very much.
My name is Sven Alkalai. I'm the Ambassador, Permanent Representative of Bosnia and Herzegovina to the United Nations. We welcome this very important event organized by the World Jewish Congress on the occasion of the 75th United Nations General Assembly on combating anti-Semitism, My country would like to give a small contribution to the general efforts in this endeavor. Bosnia and Herzegovina is a country with a population of 3.8 million. It is a true multi-ethnic, multicultural and multi-religious community. Besides the Muslim population, which is over 50%, there are Christian Orthodox, Roman Catholics and Jews. The houses of worship of these four religions stand side by side for centuries. The Jewish community is the smallest one and have the roots of the Jews who were expelled from Spain in 1492. Since then, they live in Bosnia and Herzegovina and had never to live in the ghettos. Before the Holocaust, there were 10,000 Jews in Sarajevo, but the population was decimated during the Holocaust. Now there are about 1,000 Jews in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Antisemitism is increasing in Europe, with far-right parties gaining ground in France, Belgium, Ukraine, and Netherlands. Jews may have the reason to fear again. Recently, we witnessed attacks in Paris and Brussels. But when we are talking about anti-Semitism in Bosnia and Herzegovina, I can say that practically there is no problem of anti-Semitism. The doors of our synagogue are always open. We do not have armed guards in front nor metal detectors. This is largely due to the role of the Jewish community during the war in the Balkans in 1995, when the Jewish community helped other religious and ethnic groups while living together. In order to preserve this, Jews are fully engaged through different institutional groups like Interfaith Religious Council, where all leaders of religious groups coordinate activities in order to preserve peace and tolerance. By co-sponsoring this very important and timely event, my country, Bosnia and Herzegovina, would like to contribute to the meaning that never again really means never again. Thank you.
Canada is very proud to be joining with a number of co-sponsors on this very important mission to continue to deal with anti-Semitism where we find it. Nous sommes complètement engagés dans cette bataille. Peut-être il y a ceux qui pensent que la bataille est déjà finie, c'est l'antisémitisme, c'est plus une question vivante, mais nous savons très bien que c'est une forme de racisme qui est un des plus vieux, un des plus anciens dans le monde, mais aussi, et ça c'est important, c'est vraiment quelque chose que nous devons continuer de lutter. It has contributed greatly to so many hardships for not only for the Jewish people, but for people around the world, because it has created a climate of hatred, of conspiracy theories, of ways of singling people out, of stereotyping people, and it's something which we are completely committed to combating as actively as we possibly can. Avec l'UNESCO, nous avons créé un partenariat avec le musée de l'Holocauste des États-Unis sur la question de l'éducation contre l'antisémitisme. Nous avons accepté complètement la définition qui vient de l'IHRA, et c'est important pour la bataille que nous allons continuer. Nous allons continuer la bataille à travers les organismes des Nations Unies. We want to make this a program that applies to the United Nations, the organization, in all aspects of its work. Canada is there to continue the fight against anti-Semitism, to call it out when we see it, and to deal with it when we find it. And that's exactly what we're going to continue to do.
Ladies and gentlemen, 75 years after the World War II and the terrible Holocaust, we are facing an unacceptably high level of anti-Semitism. This is a global problem exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Like all forms of intolerance and discrimination, anti-Semitism has a profound impact on society, undermining democratic values and human rights. Its solution is a matter of extreme urgency. We cannot be passive or even indifferent to this evil. We need to combat it together. We consider the fight against anti-Semitism to be an important area for deepening cooperation within the EU, the UN, UNESCO, the OSCE, the Council of Europe, and the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. The Jewish communities and other partners, to turn back the tide of rising antisemitism. I will briefly mention some specific steps we have taken or are taking to enhance the UN's efforts in combating antisemitism on a national level. Following the Prague Conference on Holocaust Assets and the Terezin Declaration, signed 11 years ago, we plan a high-level meeting during our forthcoming EU presidency in 2022 to review progress in education, the fight against antisemitism, and the restitution of Jewish property. In January 2019, the Parliament of the Czech Republic adopted the working definition of antisemitism defined by the IRA. It further recommended to use it as a critical non-legal tool in education and awareness raising and for responding to manifestations of antisemitism. In November 2019, our Chamber of Deputies adopted a resolution condemning all forms of antisemitism, including Holocaust denial. Preserving the memory of Holocaust victims as a reminder to the younger generation is crucial, as the time is approaching when the survivors and direct witnesses of this tragedy will no longer be with us. Therefore, the government approved further funding of the Holocaust Victims Foundation for the period 2020-2024, amounting to €4 million. The teaching of the Shoah is one of the main tools in the fight against growing xenophobia, racism, and antisemitism. The challenge is to find new ways to educate young people. Civil society actors can actively support the key role of the state. We are intensifying their activities in the fight against antisemitism on all fronts, from prevention to ensuring greater protection for the victims. In particular, we are trying to put in place mechanisms to detect anti-Semitic hate speech online in real time and to report them immediately to law enforcement authorities in order to prevent their further spread. Finally, let me assure you that my country is committed to combating anti-Semitism in all of its forms, whenever and wherever it arises.
We have promised to protect the Jews, to protect the Danish Jews. It is my intention to honor that commitment. Now, there is an unbroken line from this statement by Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen in September this year, and all the way to the pastoral letter from the Danish bishops in 1943, issued under the fear of an imminent deportation of Danish Jews to Nazi German concentration camps. A letter which priests read out loud in all Danish churches on October 3rd, 1943. Wherever Jews are being persecuted, it is the duty of Christians to protest, the letter stated. Race and religion should never become a pretext to deprive people of their rights, freedom, nor property, it continued. The letter also admonished that, notwithstanding our different religious views, we will fight for our Jewish brothers and sisters to maintain the same freedom, which we cherish more than our own lives. That the vast majority of the Jewish community in Denmark was brought to safety in neutral Sweden over the following days and weeks by an improvised fleet of small fishing boats is now history. It is proud history. The action saved more than 95% of all Danish Jews, who after years of exile came back to their untouched homes in Denmark in 1945. On this note, I thank you for the opportunity to address this high-level event on mainstreaming the combating of anti-Semitism within the UN system. This is an important platform to discuss how to step up the fight against anti-Semitism through the UN system, which, founded on the horrors and sufferings of the Second World War, still has the global lead in promoting human rights and protecting vulnerable groups. In November 2019, Denmark hosted an official visit of the personal representative of the OSCE chairperson in office on combating anti-Semitism, Rabbi Baker. Rabbi Baker highlighted the permanent physical protection of the Jewish community, including schools and synagogues, and the close cooperation between the government and the Jewish community as the Danish model. A model which he found could serve as an inspiration for other countries in the fight against anti-Semitism. Sadly, anti-Semitism is on the rise. globally, in Europe, and in my own country, Denmark. Consequently, in 2019, the Danish government decided to prepare a national action plan to combat anti-Semitism. Planned to be launched in early 2021, the plan will also deal with Denmark's participation in the international fight against anti-Semitism. With the necessary reservation, I can mention that in the action plan, we also expect to devise concrete steps to combat anti-Semitism through the UN. To mention one example, we expect to address anti-Semitism at the Universal Periodic Review process in a more systematic manner and to give country-specific recommendations where relevant. Another example is to actively engage in cooperation with special procedure mandate holders on matters related to anti-Semitism and submitting all relevant information without delay. We look forward to presenting the full range of initiatives with the launch of the action plan next year. Thank you.
75 years ago, the concentration camps were liberated by the Allies in a moment of astonishment for humanity. Since then, some of the survivors have overcome the need to forget by the need to transmit, to name the unspeakable in order to make the living hear the message of the dead and to ensure that this never happens again. But today, anti-Semitism is re-emerging, violent, brutal, with its procession of hatred and intolerance used by those who play on crises, on fears. Anti-Semitism is everyone's problem. It is always the first form of rejection of the other, and when it appears, all forms of racism proliferate, all divisions spread. We must fight it with force, first of all by fighting all violence and relativism, but also through education and transmission. Indifference is already complicity. As home to Europe's largest Jewish community, France is particularly committed to fight both domestically and internationally and has taken concrete measures to do so. On a national level, many measures are being implemented, particularly in the framework of the Plan to Combat Racism and Antisemitism adopted in March 2018. France can rely on clear political commitment and a rich network of public institutions, memorials and experts, as well as civil society actors active in the fights against hatred, anti-Semitism and discrimination. This proactive action is also taken at the international level, including in multilateral fora such as the United Nations. France actively participates to the fight against racism and anti-Semitism as a member of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance since its creation in 1999. We support initiatives and statements on this subject in international fora. Each year, our embassies and our educational and cultural network organize different events on these themes. This fight has also been made a priority for the Franco-German couple in 2020. France intends to remain mobilized and to continue to promote actions in support of the fight against racism, anti-Semitism and xenophobia, and against all forms of discrimination and related intolerance. We will continue to encourage states that have not yet signed and ratified the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination to do so. Rest assured that we will continue to actively participate and support international mechanisms aimed at universally combating racism, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and homophobia.
Mr. Ronald S. Lauder, President of the World Jewish Congress, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I thank the World Jewish Congress and other co-sponsors for bringing us together to address the scourge of anti-Semitism. We are happy to co-sponsor this important event. I come from a country which is home to all major religions of the world. we ourselves gave birth to several religions, the most prominent of them being Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, and Jainism. I also come from a country which does not have any trace of anti-Semitism. India has had a thriving Jewish community for more than 2,000 years. The Jewish community is an integral part of the pluralistic fabric of India, and they enrich this fabric as much as any other community. In this river called Indian civilization, every faith and every denomination is embraced in the framework of our democratic structure, pluralism, harmony, and mutual acceptance. There have been numerous milestones in this more than 2,000 years of Jewish community in India. For example, it is well known that when the Jewish community faced persecution from some European powers in the 16th century, they were granted sanctuary by the Hindu Maharaja of Cochin, Rama Varma, in Kerala. It was he who gave a land adjacent to his palace and the temple in Cochin, where the beautiful Paradesi synagogue, built in 1568, stands to this day as a proud reminder of India's Jewish heritage. In 1968, the Indian Prime Minister was personally present when the 400th anniversary of this synagogue was celebrated, attesting to the importance we attach to protecting and preserving our Jewish heritage. India is equally proud of the King of Jamnagar, Maharaja Digvijay Singh Ji, Ranjit Singh Ji Jadeja, also known as Jam Sahib, who in 1942 provided refuge and protection to more than 1,000 Polish children, including Jewish children, when they were denied entry by other countries. He brought them up as his own. In November 2008, the whole of India prayed for baby Moshe Holzberg, who was saved by his Indian caregiver from the dastardly terrorist attack in Mumbai by Pakistani terrorists. We have many well-known Jewish Indians who have distinguished themselves in all walks of life. An example is General J.F.R. Jacob, a national hero in India, having led the Eastern Command of the Indian Army during India's victory in the 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War. Ladies and gentlemen, India condemns all forms of anti-Semitism and all forms of discrimination on religious grounds anywhere in the world. We now have countries taking advantage of the ongoing pandemic and spreading divisive hatred to other parts of the world on the basis of religion. COVID has not prevented them from supporting cross-border terrorism to kill innocent people and spread religious hatred. We call on those countries to stop spreading anti-Semitism, stop spreading hatred, and stop dividing the world on the basis of religion. We ask them to look inwards to promote harmony within their own societies, stop sectarian violence, and ensure the protection of minorities. We believe it is important for the United Nations to speak decisively and not take sides with one group of religions vis-à-vis the others or justify terrorism in any way. I thank the organizers for giving me an opportunity to say a few words. Thank you.
I'm truly honored to be here today to reaffirm Italy's steadfast commitment to the fight against anti-Semitism. I want to thank Ambassador Lauder and the Permanent Mission of Germany for taking the initiative here in New York. As the Secretary General said last week, anti-Semitism is a poison, pure and simple. It is a poison which thrives on the illusion that we are somehow immune from it because of our painful history. Nothing could be farther from the truth, as we can see from the terrifying increase in anti-Semitic acts of hatred and violence across Europe. A poison which infects the most impressionable members of our communities, starting with our youth. A poison that finds fertile ground in the most economically and socially vulnerable corners of our society. These are just some of the reasons why it is incumbent upon all of us to renew our collective commitment to fighting against anti-Semitism in the multilateral arena. As a member of the Human Rights Council, the fight against anti-Semitism has been a top priority for Italy and a constant feature of our action in Geneva. In 2018, we inaugurated our OSCE chairmanship with a ministerial conference dedicated to the responsibility of states, institutions, and individuals to fight anti-Semitism. It has since become an annual tradition. Last January, the Italian government embraced the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition and appointed a national coordinator for the fight against anti-Semitism. I'm here today also to make a commitment about a concrete action we can take at the United Nations in New York. And I'm pleased to pledge that the Permanent Mission of Italy will work to promote the importance of fighting anti-Semitism through education. Every year, thousands of Italian school children participate in a national contest through essays, artworks, and other creative ways to commemorate Holocaust Remembrance Day, a widely recognized best practice which we will bring to New York and promote as a model of how to involve young people in the fight against anti-Semitism.
Hello, my friends. I'm Ambassador Juan Ramón de la Fuente, Permanent Representative of Mexico to the United Nations. And I want to thank the World Jewish Congress for convening this event on anti-Semitism. The principles contained in the Charter of the United Nations seek to develop friendly relationships among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights to all human beings. Any form of discriminatory practice, such as anti-Semitism, is unacceptable. It only promotes violence, and we know too well that hate speech leads to hate crimes. Only a little over a year ago, a radical xenophobic supremacist drove hundreds of miles to target Mexican nationals in El Paso, in Texas. Anti-Semitism is also an expression of hate and racism. We must call it by its name, hate and racism. The failed belief on racial superiority is not new, but what we see now is how social networks generate echo chambers that amplify intolerance and xenophobia. So I believe it's time to speak with one voice against these unacceptable practices that empoison societies. Remaining silent is no longer an option. As co-chair of the Group of Friends on Digital Technologies, Mexico will continue to promote the much-needed discussions around online violence, digital inclusion, and freedom of speech. The General Assembly has just adopted a resolution drafted by Mexico on cyberbullying to protect the rights of the children worldwide. Today's discussions allow us to reaffirm as well our commitment to the right to freedom of worship and the peaceful expression of beliefs. We need better practices, stronger partnerships on the defense of human rights. Memory and tolerance should go hand by hand to eradicate discriminatory practices in the world. We will continue working with Jewish organizations at the United Nations, in Mexico, and worldwide, promoting deeper cooperation towards a common front against hate and racism. We shall reinforce each other on these efforts. And we stand with the World Jewish Congress to reaffirm the commitment of the people and the government of Mexico against anti-Semitism and all forms of discrimination. Thank you very much.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Romania commends the World Jewish Congress and the Permanent Mission of Germany to the United Nations for organizing a side event on the role of the United Nations in combating anti-Semitism, which we are honored to co-sponsor. The world is currently witnessing a significant surge in hate speech triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic. Antisemitism, anti-Roma discrimination, and conspiracy theories promoted online are proliferating at a dangerous speed. Romania stays firm in preventing and combating these phenomena which generate serious concern worldwide. Against this background, we pledge to continue to encourage states and international organizations to endorse the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's non-legally binding working definition of antisemitism, to facilitate exchanges and synergies with a view to increase the United Nations' effectiveness on the fight against antisemitism, to speak out against intolerance and hate speech in all relevant international multilateral fora, to encourage partnerships with UNESCO and relevant agencies directed at fighting antisemitism through education, and promote synergies between UNESCO and other international organizations such as the European Union, the Council of Europe, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, to support the work of NGOs that fight antisemitism internationally. And finally, we pledge to continue our commitment to combat Holocaust denial and distortion, and to promote Holocaust remembrance and reparation for victims. I thank you.
Dear United Nations, distinguished High Assembly, ladies and gentlemen, the fight against antisemitism is a major world challenge in the nearest years. I address the High-Level Assembly on behalf of the Fund for Support and Development of the Jewish Culture, Traditions, Education and Science, Russia. Any form of racism, national and religious hatred is definitely no less disgusting than antisemitism, but still we highlight antisemitism. The reason behind it is that our states and societies, and even our civilization itself, are in the deepest crisis. And in times of crisis, it is antisemitism that is one of the main catalysts that could ensure a slide towards new Nazism and a new world crash. As a result of the rise of antisemitism in Europe and in the world, the Jews may be reblamed for all the troubles that happened to humanity. Pogroms of large Jewish communities will mark moral legalization de facto of inhumanity in Europe and worldwide. We all went through this, and you shouldn't go too far for historical examples. Unfortunately, the humanization and degradation of our civilizational moral foundations is an ongoing complex process, and antisemitism is not its only component. The pressure on the old traditional European Christian confessions goes on and strengthens year by year. It combines demolitions and desecrations of churches conducted by local governments and acts of vandalism and violence perpetrated by fanatics. This general process goes hand in hand with antisemitism, rehabilitation of Nazism, and leads to the destruction of the moral and humanistic foundations of society. It prepares the ground for a new war, which is to be justified by dehumanization and inequality of peoples. Russian Federation consistently and steadily makes great efforts aimed at changing the situation, especially promoting at the UN General Assembly an annual resolution on combating the glorification of Nazism. Russian NGOs conduct researches and effectively create conditions for bringing to justice Nazi criminals and murderers of Jews who are still alive. There is no doubt that antisemitism and its consequences should be rebuffed at the highest international level, at the United Nations. Recommendations of the Fund for Support of Development of the Jewish Culture, Traditions, Education and Science. First, to adopt a new expanded UN Security Council resolution reaffirming the principle of non-application of the Statute of Limitations to war crimes and crimes against humanity, underlining and mentioning the Holocaust, crimes of genocide based on xenophobia, racism, and antisemitism. We should regularly upgrade this resolution on an annual basis, like the resolution on the fight against the glorification of Nazism. And second, to initiate creation of a high-level group under the United Nations Secretary General to counter the rehabilitation of Nazism, racism, xenophobia, and anti-Semitism. Thanks all of you for your attention.
Slovakia pledges to continue supporting the fight against anti-Semitism at UN fora all around the world. Having in mind great need to fight anti-Semitism through education, Slovakia will cooperate with UNESCO on special programs addressing the issue. As an active member of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, Slovakia will further promote implementation of IHRA definition of anti-Semitism adopted by the Slovak government in 2018. Firmly rejecting anti-Semitism and discrimination will be of utmost importance to us in the work of the UN General Assembly, the Human Rights Council, and the Universal Periodic Reviews. Against the growing religious intolerance and violence against Jews in Europe and elsewhere, Slovakia will take part in relevant national and international actions to combat anti-Semitism and hate speech, both online and offline.
Thank you to the member states for their pledges. I would now like to give the floor to the permanent representative of Uruguay.
Thank you very much. On behalf of Uruguay, first of all, I would like to extend my gratitude to the World Jewish Congress and my fellow co-sponsors on the well-timed call for this event on the role of the United Nations in the combat against anti-Semitism. We are all aware of how during the COVID-19 pandemic, the anti-Semitism has resuscitated together with other religious intolerances and a general fear to the diversity. This could lead to a threat to the right to freedom of religion or belief and should therefore be of the highest importance within the United Nations and the human rights protection system. Uruguay welcomed the steps taken by the United Nations towards the protection of the Jewish people and to combat anti-Semitism from a human rights-based perspective, highlighting the steps taken by the United Nations, such as the elaboration of UN strategy for the action plan on hate speech and the publication of a report on the fight against anti-Semitism to eliminate discrimination and intolerance based on religion or belief by the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief. Uruguay is not alien to this trouble zone, as our struggle against discrimination is based on the principles of equality and especially established under our constitution, and basically, in practical terms, in two essential principles. First, recognize the intrinsic dignity of the human being without distinction on the basis of race, religion, nationality, origin, ethnic, language, sex, political opinion, sexual orientation, or any other matter, founded on principles of equality under the law established with our Constitution. Secondly, the conviction that democracy is the only political system capable of ensuring the joy and respect of human rights for every human being, and that, for that reason, the fight against racism indissolubly of the existence of the democratic system. Our country has recently adopted the definition of International Alliance for the Remembrance of the Holocaust, according to which anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which might be expressed as a hate toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are direct toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community, institution, and religion facility. Therefore, Uruguay reaffirms its active commitment in the struggle against any form of discrimination, as well as against any other kind of hostility and harm against the Jewish population. Along these lines, Uruguay today reinforces its commitment to firmly repudiate any act of violence directed against members of the Jewish community, including denial of the Holocaust and other expressions of hatred that have also been clearly rejected by society as a whole. This historical stance can be projected toward the future as our digital educative platform, Plan Ceibal, includes academic units in its program teaching our children on the Shoah and the rejection of antisemitism. In 1989, Uruguay reformed by law the penal code establishes the crime of instigation to the hate, contempt, or any other form of physical or moral violence for reason of color, race, religion, or national or ethnic origin. Following the recommendation of the Durban Conference by Law 17677 of 1903, the penalties of prison for the crimes of incitation of hate, contempt, of violence against people in reason of color, race, ethnic, or national origin or sexual orientation has been incremented. Since 2004, by another law, the 17807, the Uruguayan Parliament declares of national interest the fight against racism, creating the Honorary Commission Against Racism, Xenophobia, and any form of discrimination. This Honorary Commission is made up by 5 representatives of the state and 3 of the civil society, being one of them the Central Israeli Committee of Uruguay. Let me conclude by underscoring that Uruguay renewed its commitments toward reinforcing the role of the UN in the fight against antisemitism, and this role can only be supported by strong and ambitious internal legislation, domestic policies, and above all, political will. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I would like to remind you that you can find the video pledges and the written pledges on the website of this event. On behalf of the World Jewish Congress, I would again like to thank the Permanent Mission of Germany to the UN, as well as the co-sponsoring states for making this event happen. I would also like to thank the speakers, the 5 panelists, the team behind the scenes who has made this event possible, and of course you, the audience. I would like to close with a quote of United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, dating back to 2017, when he said, "As Secretary General of the United Nations, I will be on the front line of the struggle against anti-Semitism to make sure the United Nations is able to take all possible actions for anti-Semitism to be condemned and, if possible, eradicated from the face of the earth." Thank you all for having joined us today. Please be safe and healthy.